Welcome to The Shift. I'm your host, Michael O'Heaney, the Story of Stuff Project's Executive Director. We started The Shift in April to talk with the thinkers and doers shaping how we're seeing and reacting to the coronavirus pandemic and what comes after. But over the past month, our focus has necessarily been drawn further out to the triple intersecting crises we're living through in America today. The COVID-19 public health crisis, of course, and the resulting unemployment and growing poverty in our country, as well as the crisis of racial injustice brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd, and, of course, the crisis of our poisoned environment exemplified by climate change. On today's episode, a special co-production of The Shift with the Cancer-Free Economy Network, we'll be covering a subject that in many ways intersects with all three crises in America. So let's get to it. According to a recent Harvard School of Public Health study, living in a community with high levels of air pollution increases the likelihood of dying from COVID-19. The study looked at more than 3,000 counties across the country, comparing levels of fine particulate air pollution with coronavirus death counts for each area. The authors found that people living in counties that have experienced a higher level of air pollution over the past 15 to 17 years have a substantially higher COVID-19 mortality rate, which of course begs two questions. First, are we as a country focusing the resources to fight COVID-19 where they are most needed? And even more importantly, could what we've learned from the pandemic inspire investments in building healthier communities over the long term? Today, we're joined by Dr. Francesca Dominici, the Harvard researcher whose team uncovered the link between air pollution and COVID-19 outcomes. Dr. Dominici is the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Biostatistics, Population, and Data Science at Harvard's Chan School and the director of the school's Data Science Initiative. We're also joined by Kimathi Boothe, a longtime environmental justice advocate from Michigan. Ki is co-lead of the Cancer-Free Economy Network's Building Power Node and Environmental Injustice co-chair for the NAACP's Northern Oakland County branch. Thank you both first so much for joining us. Dr. Dominici, I want to start with you. To many of our viewers, the link you found between air pollution and COVID-19 deaths probably won't come as a huge surprise. Nonetheless, the study has created some controversy, including a terse response from the EPA. Could you just start by sort of walking viewers through what you and your fellow investigators found?
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. So we and my whole team, we have been studying health effects of air pollution for a very long time, and myself and colleagues all around the world have been extensively documented the adverse health effect of long-term exposure to fine particulate matter. And also, more specifically, only a couple of years ago, we published a study showing a direct link between exposure to fine particulate matter and acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is one of the main causes of death for coronavirus. So I agree with you, actually, the hypothesis that exposure to fine particulate matter could increase the vulnerability for COVID-19 it's very natural just because, the entire body of evidence that we know about how fine particulate matter affect our lungs and initiate an inflammation system. And we now know and keep gaining knowledge about the fact that coronavirus affect our lungs. So it's not surprising to hypothesize that exposure to fine particulate matter together with an infection of COVID is really a very high dangerous combination. So we did what we could with this very first, which I admit, preliminary study. We will only be able to gather data on COVID-19 deaths at county level. So we will not be able to make a statement about individual level relationship, but still with this statistical analysis, what we tried to do is the best that we could, considering the data that we have at hand. And indeed, as you mentioned, we did find that counties that historically have a higher level of pollution have a higher mortality rate for COVID-19, accounting for many of the other characteristics of the counties that might explain this relationship. So, for example, we did account for population density, for when the stage of the epidemics, the socioeconomic status, and many of the other potential, body mass index, the smoking rate. I mean, anything that we could think about. So I think that, and there are many more studies coming up all around the world. I think now at this stage, with only, although it feels forever, but we're only 3 months into collecting data on COVID-19. I think this evidence is for sure preliminary. I think there are a long list of issues that we will need to address, but definitely it speaks to the need of looking at this scientific question very closely, and as well as it speaks to whether or not at this time, with the pandemic attacking our lung, is a wise decision not to lower the national ambient air quality standard,
Right.
considering all of the evidence that we have about this harmful health effect of fine particulate matter.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. This spring, so as you mentioned, this spring, the EPA declined to strengthen the particulate matter standards during a periodic review, something that public health experts and many others have been calling for. When asked to respond to your study's findings by a Republican congressman, the EPA said, and I want to quote here, "Drawing conclusions from a study without peer review and with insufficient data is irresponsible and paints a distorted scientific picture." I want to ask you first to sort of respond to that assertion and sort of the pushback you've been getting, and then give us a sense of your thinking in terms of, is now a good time to be avoiding improvements to the particulate matter air quality standards?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think, you can ask any nonpartisan, I would say sensible human being, as whether you think that, a pandemic that affect our lungs and whether or not this is a good time to give license to pollute the air. I mean,
Right.
Ask to anyone. And I think anyone with a minimum level of responsibility will give it the right answer. Second of all, I think that this is not about this last study and the quality of this study. All of these studies that we are putting on preprints and going peer review, of course, they have a tons of limitation. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and generally, the best way to conduct science is to do a control experiment where you control everything except what you want to measure. And I'm asking you whether in the time of a pandemic, there is nothing we can control. So
Sure.
clearly there is, I'm not defending that the study that we have done is the best in the world, and is, that of course has to be peer reviewed, of course has a ton of limitation. But also I think the important point is that above and beyond this particular study, there are thousands of studies. There are over 10 years of evidence telling us that exposure to fine particulate matter, even a level below the national ambient air quality standard. We published a study 3 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was a study of 65 million older American, and showed that exposure to fine particulate matter, even below the national ambient air quality standard, increased mortality risk. And by the way, we showed that we increased the mortality risk for African American that was 3 times higher than the national average. So I think that, attacking this latest non-review study as a tactic to lower the national ambient air quality standard, I would consider a non-scientific tactic. I think what we need to do is to act, talking about responsibility, I think we have to act in a responsible way, looking at the evidence and the science that is already there before COVID, and then ask yourself, based on what we know about COVID and based on what we know about fine particulate matter, whether this is the right time to pollute the air.
Right. Thank you so much. Boothe, you've been a key contributor to the growth of the Cancer-Free Economy Network, which seeks to lift the burden of cancers in this country in a generation by eliminating hazardous chemicals and other environmental health contributors to that awful disease. Key, you and I have talked before about how unfairly health risk is distributed in this country and the disproportionate impacts felt by so-called fence line communities, in this case, those with higher exposure to fine particulate air pollution. I'm going to ask Miguel, our producer, to play a clip by an NAACP colleague of yours, Jacqueline Patterson, who testified before Congress in early June about the impact of COVID-19 on environmental justice communities. And by way of context, just before the cut we're playing, Jacqueline was referencing Dr. Dominici's report. So go ahead, Miguel.
To add to the injustice, African American and Latino American people are typically exposed to 56 and 63% more PM2.5 pollution than they produce through consumption and daily activities. Yet another dimension to the injustice. Furthermore, the health effects associated with indoor air pollution include respiratory illnesses, heart disease, and cancer, each of which have been linked to increased vulnerability to mortality due to COVID-19. And once again, African Americans are more likely to have respiratory conditions exacerbated by indoor air pollution.
Ki, you're in Michigan, which has been hard hit by the pandemic. I guess I just want to start by asking, did anything in Dr. Dominici's or Ms. Patterson's summaries surprise you?
Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. Living within the community, often we certainly rely on the expertise of scientists and the like, but there's no expertise like experience. And when you grow up and you have family and friends who suffer from asthma and all other types of breathing and respiratory conditions, and you watch their quality of life, really suffer over the course of their life. And that's often irrespective of class, irrespective of your economic income, because as a community, we're really all tied together. So we visit one another, we travel, where we go to school and where we worship and where we play. These are all very tightly intertwined. And when you layer on top of that the systematic oppressions and policies that really have contributed to these disparities, it just is really no surprise that even though there may not be a direct, scientifically peer-reviewed, perfectly authored study or multiple studies to account for that, by far, I think there are millions of people who would not be surprised by that and who, in fact, would state emphatically that that's true.
Yeah. I want to maybe sort of put a finer point on this question. So while African Americans make up only 14% of the population of your state, Ki, Michigan, they account for more than 30% of COVID-19 cases and 40% of deaths. And I guess I'm curious, what's the conversation like in your state or your local community around those kinds of statistics? Are you seeing responses from local or state leaders to the kinds of findings that certainly that Dr. Dominici has offered, but more generally to this sort of disproportionate impact that COVID is having on African Americans and other people of color?
Yeah, there's really there is an awareness of underlying conditions, especially as it relates to the vulnerabilities of various respiratory conditions. The bifurcation of that conversation comes in the community and out of the community. The concern is that underlying conditions becomes a condition of its own, and not the causes of those underlying conditions thoroughly explored and uncovered. Our governor has put together a task force led up by the lieutenant governor to address some of these disparities, as well as in the county. Again, the continuous fight and concern in the community is that those voices in the community are at the table. Often the decisions and the solutions come to the community, not out of the community, which often further exacerbates the problem and at the least mitigates real solutions to the problem. So while there have been some efforts, there's certainly a long way to go forward in that. One example, just to bring up, Michael, is the idea that in this time of COVID, when you should be washing your hands thoroughly and cleaning off your doorknobs and maintaining as much sanitation as possible, that you would have your water shut off in your home. That just seems completely unbelievable. And these are the types of fights that we fight in our community. I just want to bring up one last point in that,
of course,
it isn't just the underlying conditions. It isn't just the particulate matter. What we find and what we're finding and what this pandemic has exposed is that when we go to the hospital, we're sent home 3 times before we're seen and actually tested for COVID. So those type of systematic disparities are really just elevated and highlighted through this COVID pandemic that we've been fighting through our community for so long. And these impacts are cumulative. So environmental issues, along with health issues, along with education issues, justice, criminal justice issues, these become compounded and really accumulative in the lives of our community members.
Yeah, and Dr. Thank you. Dr. Dominici, I want to sort of bring you into this conversation. A colleague of yours at Harvard Public Health School, Nancy Krieger, was interviewed in the New Yorker in April and responded to sort of the growing evidence that we've been talking about, that COVID was disproportionately affecting African Americans and others of Americans of color. Dr. Krieger pointed to various causes of racial disparity, some of which Key just discussed, employment, housing, access to services, but also pointed to your study around air pollution. And I guess, you've heard Jacqueline Patterson, you've heard Key point in that direction as well. I understand in previous interviews you've been sort of cautious, understandably, and you mentioned previously that your study used county level data, didn't sort of dive into other population distinctions. But having said that, do you think the work, what you're looking at, might at least partly explain why we're seeing these sort of disproportionate impacts on communities of color in the United States?
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I couldn't agree more with all of the points that Kate said. There is a constellation of factors, and I think that that's why we, at this time of the pandemics, and in general, any type of climate change related disaster or any type of environmental exposure, even when we are talking about coronavirus, when we're talking about wildfires, when we're talking about hurricanes, when we're talking about heat waves, the most vulnerable population and community, based on their comorbidity, based on the socioeconomic status, based on their ability to affect healthcare, and based on racism, are the one that we need to pay most of the attention. The most privileged community are all of the one that have better ability and better tools to protect themselves. So, you're never going to have the perfect data to point it out, but to me, that's irresponsible. And just in a compassionate way of thinking of public health disaster. Now, looking at our studies, there are a lot of factors that point toward this direction. So first of all, I think, as Keith has mentioned, we know based on data that Afro-American population breathe much higher level of air pollution than everybody else. And not only that, but we are working on another study showing that even though fine particulate matter is the levels are going down across the United States, the health disparity in who breathes high pollution level and who doesn't are actually increasing. So, so that's one factor. That is proved by data. The second factor, as I said in some of my previous studies, we did find that the relationship between fine particulate matter and all-cause mortality is 3 times higher for an Afro-American. In the county level analysis that we did for COVID, we also found that the mortality rate for COVID-19 was much higher in communities that were prevalently Afro-American. Now, in this last COVID study, we could not disentangle the relationship between PM2.5 and race, because as as I mentioned, the data for mortality for COVID comes at aggregated level for county. And so we couldn't break it down by race. But clearly, even though it's not, as my colleague Nancy Krieger pointed out in his beautiful report, there's not going to be the only factor, but there is a series of these concomitant factors, as Kate mentioned, because that's what's happening in this community. And so I think that we have to act on all of them, because this is not part of what is the culprit. The most important thing that we have to keep in mind is that we have to protect this community and act in a responsible way for public health.
Yeah. I'm curious, Doctor, part of the sort of criticism of the work that you put out was that it was, sort of put out quickly, right? It was pre-peer review. And I guess sort of what drove that decision? Why were you so anxious to get what you were seeing out into the public conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a decision also have to make quickly. First of all, the peer review takes, some time, and in the best of the circumstances, it takes a year or two to get a paper out from when you submit. And I felt that, that was not, we didn't have the luxury to wait a year or two before saying that air pollution could make COVID-19 worse, because I actually believe it's true. Second of all, I think that as there is the EPA decision or lower the national ambient air quality standard, I think even though I will face some criticism, I do think it was a responsible act from my side to get whatever I know and whatever the data out there. And by the way, the data and the code that we did analysis are publicly available. So even though it wasn't peer reviewed, it is not fully peer reviewed. And of course, it has, let me make it clear, the study has a lot of limitation because it's a county level data. So, I know the limitation that the study had, and I know what my colleagues are saying about the study, but still, that's the only data we have. So, it's going to be years, and maybe 5 years or 10 years until we have a national registry of individual level patients for COVID. So we are in the middle of a pandemic, and the words I'm saying is, let's make sure we breathe clean air. So I don't think it would have been a responsible way for me to wait 2 years based on all I know to say something like that. That to me sounds pretty sensible.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been struck by this last week doing some research for our show is, even in the data around COVID outcomes, there's a huge chunk of the data that's missing race information, standard death certificate kind of information, but there's a huge chunk of the data that's missing that. So to sort of put the onus on researchers who are working with time constraints, with data constraints, those kinds of things, I appreciate why you would take the approach you did. Key at the Story of Stuff project, we often say that you have to sort of both fight the bad and build the good. And I want to sort of talk to you. In addition to being an activist and an advocate, you're an engineer and an energy efficiency advocate. Talk to me how you sort of see those two worlds. We're talking about air quality. How do you see the sort of those two worlds intersecting? Tell me about that.
Sure. First, I would certainly like to tip my hat and give very big accolades to Dr. Dominici. The work she put out and how she put it out demonstrates just what I was talking about in terms of really being human-centered. I'm all for the scientific process. I'm an electrical engineer by trade. But if you're not focused in on humans, then all of that is, it's somewhere else. And she released that really in the tradition of someone we hold high in regards here in Michigan, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who did the very same thing in releasing data regarding the lead in the Flint water. And that was prior to peer review and all of that, but that saved countless lives and certainly brought attention maybe years before otherwise. So just want to take that moment to again acknowledge and appreciate that work and the effort. It isn't easy to release that. So that effort we certainly appreciate. And to answer your point, it is somewhat. I find myself in a difficult situation. One of my largest clients is the large incumbent electric utility who operates coal-fired power plants and the like. So, working as a living in that industry, I really, over the course of 15 years, found myself aligning more and more with justice issues and energy efficiency and sustainability. All of that really, really is speaking much of the same language when we talk about equity. If you're not talking about equity when you're talking about designing in a sustainable fashion, then that means you're just sustaining the current inequities. So all of these type of things are really related in that type of direction, and that's where I've been able to find some I guess the middle path there.
So great, so great. I want to close maybe with sort of the same question to both of you, if you want to just take a minute to respond each. Our country is focused right now on the concept of public health with an intensity I certainly can't remember. And the pandemic seems to have created kind of a sense that we, the public, are all in this together. And so, with the concept of public health in the spotlight and with this sense of social solidarity prevailing, where do you think we should be focusing our energies around these questions that we've talked about today? What additional research do we need? What regulatory or financial interventions do we need? Give me just maybe a minute each on how we should be approaching next steps. Maybe, Doctor, you could talk about where your research might go next.
Yeah. Complicated question. I think that, first of all, I feel, I was born and raised in Italy, and I was in Europe until I was 25, and then I spent the second 25 years of my life in the US. And I think what really makes incredible to me in the US is the tremendous range of socioeconomic status of this country. And I think that, to me, what we need to do is focus on the most vulnerable communities. We know where they are, we know who they are, and I think that I still find horrendous the fact that people cannot have access to healthcare and they don't have availability to treatment. They are, they get their water shut down and they don't have access to education, and they're breathing polluted air. So I think where the resources they need to be spent in the most vulnerable community. The data are clear, and we need to protect their health. That's, to me, a no-brainer. And so all of these injustices just need to be eliminated. And I hope that if we're going to have a different administration, there will be a different way to look at that. I think personally for our research, we're really focusing now much more into an environmental justice angle. I think that I felt even more strongly, and I think as a scientist, that's a responsibility that we have to do. And COVID data are imprecise, but we have so much more data that we can look in a much more systematic factor. And I think these research about link of environmental exposure and COVID, again, this is just a new area of research. We are just starting. We're just scratching the surface. So there will definitely be more work. And finally, where I am is I'm really proud that we have a wonderful group of students from the Harvard College. They are being contacted as a result of that work, where they want to be involved and they want to help. And so to me, also the most important thing is, instead of focusing on a specific research question, is to train the next generation to put a human face into science and really focusing on what is important to make, what are the more important problems, because we're going to face multiple crises. And so we need the next generation to be able to have the training and the compassion to solve this problem together.
Thank you for that. Key, next steps, where should our viewers be putting pressure? Where should we be going from here?
Wow, really everything that Dr. Dominici said, I would certainly add to that, maybe from our perspective, it's really about the policies, how do we put policies in place that really address those issues? We see with COVID that, if you ignore the most vulnerable, that can crash your whole healthcare system.
Sure.
So for us, it's, developing policies and making sure that those most vulnerable communities and those most vulnerable people are at the heart of developing those policies.
Thank you, Key, and thank you both again for joining us on the shift. Special thanks again to our friends at the Cancer Free Economy Network for co-producing this episode with us. You can find the network online at cancerfreeeconomy.org. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in. You can find additional episodes of The Shift at storyofstuff.org and on the Story of Stuff Project's social media channels. Until next time, thanks so much for watching.